It was a calm summer evening in July 1982 when an unsuspecting fisherman along the Green River in Washington state noticed something unsettling. At first, he thought it was driftwood, caught in the gentle current near the riverbank. But as he drew closer, the horrifying truth became undeniable. A young woman's lifeless body floated just beneath the surface, her pale, bloated skin catching the fading sunlight. Her hair fanned out like seaweed, eerily motionless in the murky water. Shocked and terrified, the man called the police. Little did he know, this gruesome discovery would mark the beginning of one of the most chilling murder cases in American history. In the months that followed, more bodies were discovered, all dumped in or near the Green River. Each victim was young, vulnerable, and brutally murdered. The community was paralyzed with fear. A monster was among them, preying on the defenseless, and his appetite for killing seemed insatiable. Yet for nearly 2 decades, the Green River Killer would evade capture, weaving a web of terror and tragedy that still haunts the region today. Who was this man? What drove him to commit such unimaginable acts of violence? And how did he manage to elude justice for so long? This is the story of Gary Ridgway, a quiet, unassuming man who turned out to be one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The Green River flows through King County, Washington, a region known for its natural beauty. Surrounded by lush forests and rolling hills, it's a place that seems almost untouched by the chaos of urban life. In the early 1980s, the area was a mix of suburban tranquility and industrial activity, with small towns and communities scattered along its banks. It was a place where people felt safe, where children played in their yards, and neighbors looked out for one another. But the river's remote stretches also provided the perfect cover for a killer. Gary Ridgway knew this area intimately. As a truck painter and longtime resident of the region, he understood its hidden paths, its secluded corners. He knew where he could dump a body without being seen, where the currents would carry away the evidence of his crimes. The Green River became his dumping ground, a silent accomplice to his unspeakable acts. It was here, in the shadow of its serene beauty, that he committed his first murders, setting off a reign of terror that would last for decades. Ridgway's victims were often young women, many of them sex workers or runaways who lived on the margins of society. These women were vulnerable, easy targets for a predator like Ridgway, who lured them with promises of safety, money, or companionship. Once he gained their trust, he would strike with cold precision, strangling them with his hands or a ligature. He would then dump their bodies in remote locations, often revisiting the sites to commit acts of necrophilia. One of the first victims identified was Wendy Caulfield, a 16-year-old girl whose body was found in the Green River just weeks after her disappearance. Wendy was bright and full of potential, but her life had taken a difficult turn. Like many of Ridgway's victims, she had dreams and struggles that were cut short by his brutality. Her story was tragically similar to those of dozens of others who would follow. Each victim was more than just a name on a list. They were daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives were stolen too soon. As the bodies began to pile up, fear gripped the community. Women were afraid to walk alone, especially at night. Families urged their daughters to stay home, to avoid hitchhiking or venturing into dangerous areas. But for many of Ridgway's victims, there was no choice. They lived on the edge, and the predator knew exactly how to exploit their desperation. From the moment Wendy Caulfield's body was discovered, local law enforcement knew they were dealing with something far more sinister than a single isolated crime. Over the next few months, 4 more bodies were found in or near the Green River, each one bearing similar signs of violence. The pattern was undeniable. A serial killer was at work. The King County Sheriff's Office formed a task force to investigate the murders, dedicating significant resources to catching the Green River Killer. Detectives worked around the clock, following up on leads, interviewing witnesses, and scouring the crime scenes for evidence. But the killer was careful. He left behind few clues, and forensic technology in the early 1980s was limited. DNA profiling was still in its infancy, and many of the tools investigators rely on today simply didn't exist. Despite these challenges, the task force pressed on. They created a profile of the killer based on the victims' patterns and the locations where their bodies were found. They believed he was a local man, someone familiar with the area who could blend in without arousing suspicion. But identifying him among the thousands of potential suspects was like finding a needle in a haystack. In 1983, the task force interviewed a man named Gary Ridgway, a quiet, soft-spoken truck painter who lived and worked in the area. Ridgway seemed cooperative, even taking a polygraph test, which he passed. Investigators noted his calm demeanor and lack of any apparent connection to the victims. For a while, he slipped off their radar, free to continue his killing spree. What they didn't know at the time was that Ridgway was a master manipulator. He knew how to blend in, how to appear unthreatening. His life seemed ordinary. He was married, held a steady job, and even attended church regularly. But behind closed doors, he harbored dark fantasies that drove him to kill again and again. To understand Ridgway's crimes, one must delve into his troubled past. Born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, Ridgway grew up in a dysfunctional household. His mother was domineering and emotionally abusive, often humiliating him in front of others. Ridgway later claimed that he had conflicting feelings about her. He loved and hated her at the same time. This complex relationship may have played a role in shaping his violent tendencies. As a child, Ridgway struggled academically and socially. He was often bullied and ridiculed, which only deepened his sense of isolation. By the time he reached adulthood, he had developed a deep-seated anger toward women, viewing them as objects rather than human beings. This dehumanization allowed him to commit his crimes without remorse, treating his victims as mere tools to fulfill his twisted desires. It wasn't until 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first murders, that DNA evidence finally caught up with Gary Ridgway. Advances in forensic science allowed investigators to match samples from several victims to Ridgway's DNA, conclusively linking him to the crimes. When confronted with the evidence, Ridgway confessed to killing 49 women, though he claimed the actual number was closer to 70 or 80. His confessions were chilling in their detail and lack of emotion. Ridgway described how he selected his victims, how he killed them, and how he disposed of their bodies. He showed no remorse, only a cold, detached acknowledgement of his actions. For the families of the victims, his words were a painful reminder of the horrors their loved ones had endured.